Timothy Wyllie, thanks so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate you giving us some of your time. Could you give us a brief biography of yourself, please?
I'm English. I was born in 1940, educated in England, qualified as an architect, and then became a kind of co-founder of a community, a spiritual community that started in London in the early 60s called The Process. And I spent 15 years with The Process, left it in about 1977, ran a small business in New York of an invention that I had put together when I was young for my mother's company, a system of storing films and film strips and slides. So that's what I did in New York. Then I had a near-death experience which kind of totally blew my mind and blew me wide open and kind of totally changed my life. And I became very, very interested in the fact that this reality that we experience is not the only reality. There are other realities which I experienced in the near-death experience. And so I really got involved in that and started studying dolphins, and then got involved with extraterrestrial interests, and then involved in angelic interests. And the result of that has been 4 or 5 books about non-human intelligences. And that kind of brings you up to date.
Excellent. Okay, so can you give us a kind of, in a nutshell, a kind of synopsis of what the Process Church of the Final Judgment is?
Yes, it's very hard to do the nutshell because you need an awful lot of nuts.
Yeah.
We changed quite radically over the years that it was. First the Process, then the Process Church, and then the Foundation. And now it's off in Utah being an animal sanctuary called the Best Friends. It's no longer a religious or spiritual organization. Anyway, it really, the fundamental basis of it was a psychotherapy that we had evolved, which allowed us to dig really very deeply into our subconscious and our unconscious motivations and understandings, the stuff that we all push down. Now, once we started dealing with that, spiritual information, if you like, or these spiritual questions start coming up, because you start to, well, why am I really here? Who am I? All the old questions that people have always asked. And so, in a sense, we then became much more of a psychically interested. We were developing telepathy, and using our psychism in various quite interesting ways. But anyway, then that moved into a more spiritual area. But the fundamental, if you like, the fundamental spiritual nugget of the process was the unification of opposites. The feeling that unless we unify or have some way of understanding the unity which comes from, this polarized existence we live in, where things are good or bad or whatever. So the idea of pulling those together, both in our own personalities, but also, in the social sphere in which we're living as well. So that was the basis of the process. How do we first experience the negative aspects of the self, and then how do we assimilate those negative aspects into a whole personality?
That's interesting. That's as Aleister Crowley famously quoted, the great work is the unification of opposites. It was something like that, wasn't it?
Yes, it's very fundamental in European mysticism. Actually, in almost all mystical traditions, it's the perennial issue, if you like. But yes, of course.
So can you tell us a little bit about Robert de Grimston, Mary Ann Moore, and like how the actual group kind of began and the kind of roots in Scientology?
I'd known Robert because we studied architecture together. So I'd known Robert prior to this whole thing by 4 or 5 years. He disappeared out of all of our lives at architectural college, and when he came back into my life about 2 years later, he had been at Scientology for I think about a year, and had met Mary Ann at Scientology, and they had decided they would they could do better than Hubbard. And they had all sorts of understandings of how the E-meter really should be working, because really what Hubbard was doing, if you know anything about the E-meter,
Yeah.
is Hubbard was actually creating little Hubbards
Yeah.
by programming people to have the same responses he had. They were using it in a very different way, and to draw out of people their basic agreements, their basic compulsions. So it's a very different process.
At which point in Scientology's history is this as well? I've always been interested in this because obviously Scientology itself went through various phases as well. Obviously it started off as like Dianetics work groups and then moved into actual Church of Scientology status. What sort of period in Scientology's history are we looking at here as well?
I would imagine this would be it was still East Grinstead. I don't think it was a church yet, actually.
Yeah, I think it was.
I'm not quite sure. I don't know a great deal about their history, but it was probably something like 61, maybe.
That's quite
61, 62.
So obviously these guys left Scientology, Robert de Grimston and Marianne Moore, but how did they kind of I guess I believe a community sort of began to evolve out of that union, I suppose.
Well, what happened was that they they called me up out of the blue and asked if I would be a guinea pig for them while they perfected their processes with the meter. And since I had already been doing some of that sort of work in the local psychological institute to earn some money, I would be the guinea pig for student psychologists. I had a certain sort of affinity with that area, so I guess that's why they asked me. So after doing some sessions with them, I became really very enthusiastic about it, and I had a lot of friends at that point, and a lot of them got very interested, and then their friends and. I think Robert and Marion had one other person, a lawyer that they were working with also in the same way as they were working with me, so some of his friends. So within a year or two, there were 40 or 50 people who were pretty much, focused on the work that the process was doing.
Okay.
It was called compulsions analysis at that point. That was prior to being called the process.
So did the groups release any kind of literature at this point, or was this?
No, it didn't. No, those were early days, and it was all really word of mouth. And there were 2 meetings a week. I think probably later ages would have called them encounter groups. But Robert and Marianne worked very well together. He's very intelligent, perhaps a little too rational, and Marianne is very intuitive, and perhaps a little too crazy.
So can you tell us a little bit about the kind of the general social climate in England at the time, and at the time of the actual, I guess, when the group began to become a bit more public, how did England, I suppose, in this period of time, respond to something like the Process Church?
Well, firstly, England was in a terrible state at that point. I mean, the 50s were absolutely frightful. We're coming out of the war. Nobody had any money rationed, and by the 60s, the early 60s, it was still really very, very drudge-like. And the additional factor, of course, was this damn bomb thing that was hanging over everybody's heads. And I think many of us, certainly of my generation, were absolutely convinced that war was going to be really quite imminent. And I've only realized recently how I never really planned for the future. I hadn't thought that there would ever be a future. So, now I'm in the future. It's kind of curious. We wouldn't, of course, we were never well received. I mean, we were absolutely outrageous for a start. I mean, we were pushing people's buttons, particularly around responsibility. Sort of digging in and really sort of getting to the point of trying to get across the fact that every person is entirely responsible for themselves. There are no excuses. There is nobody to blame. Now, that's a very, very harsh criteria to live one's life by, if one can do it. But it is a very, very eye-opening, and it's a very maturing and intelligent way to live, because by taking the power back, by taking responsibility, even for, let's say, an airplane wheel dropping on one's head, say, absurd example. Of course, one is responsible for being under it, you know. Now, by taking responsibility for things that happen to you, that appear to happen out of the blue, one actually retains the power. One's no longer, you know, rendered powerless by the environment, by events, by governments, by policemen, by whatever, you know, because one has the power back. That's not an easy message to get across. And although I wasn't present at these two gatherings, Robert did a large lecture at the Oxford Union and one at LSE, and he was roundly booed and harshly rejected by the mass of the people there. But of course, every once in a while there'd be two or three in the audience who would come up and say, "Hey, yeah, no, this makes a lot of sense." And we were never into getting large groups of people. We were very elitist in that sense. We only wanted people who really could, you know, deal with life as we saw it.
So, how did I mean, obviously, you said you started off as a kind of commune, a kind of community. How did you start to become a kind of, I guess, a group that existed with a name, and, you know, how did you sort of turn into the Process Church from being this commune?
And where did the name also come from? Because I know, I read that there was a few other names in the pipeline before that.
Well, you know, when it was compulsions analysis, it was not a community. It wasn't. You know, we weren't living communally.
More
although
like a study group.
Small groups of about 3 or 4 people would be living in an apartment here or there. When they got Balfour Place, which was a kind of mansion just behind Park Lane, it just made more sense for everybody to move in together. It was a 6-story building. And, you know, we were getting to a point where we all knew each other so well at that point that it just made logical sense, and also very saving of money, to all live together. So that's really how we became a commune in that sense. Becoming a community was something a little more complex, because we really got to a point in about 64 or 65, I think, when we just said, hey, you know, why are we here? Why are we in England if they hate us so much? And, you know, we were starting to get, you know, people curious about us, and, you know, in a sort of rather unpleasant way. So we went off to start a new life, to start a new community on an island somewhere. And so off we went, and it's a long story, and I recounted it in my book, the Love, Sex, Fear, Death book, of going to Nassau and then going to Mexico and then down to the Yucatan. That's really when we became a community, Ken. That's when, you know, the spirit was really driving us at that point.
I've always wanted to know, how did the Church of Scientology respond to the Process Church?
I think they probably ignored us for a long time. We weren't really on their radar. I think they probably had more beef with people like the Hare Krishna and the Moonies, because they really were, you know, taking the same people. We tended to, you know, not go in precisely those areas. But what happened when the Manson thing broke? Scientology material was found at Spahn Ranch. I think it's fairly well established.
Yeah.
And what I've been able to find out, and I have not seen the press release, so I have to be cautious about that, but what I believed happened was Scientology completely freaked out about that and put out a press release the very next morning, or within a day or two, of the Spahn Ranch being raided, basically accusing the process as being the people behind Manson. So that really started a whole, you know, very unpleasant series of events.
Yeah.
Although I think we probably handled it fairly well.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm just going back to when you said that you're going to Mexico. One thing that's really grabbed my attention about the Process Church is all the magazines that you released, and all the artwork, which I understand you did, which is amazing. But I heard that they made some films in Mexico, some sort of promotional films.
No.
No?
No.
Okay.
No.
I think
No, I mean, think of the time, 1965.
Yeah.
There was no video. maybe 16 millimeter, but nobody had any cameras. We barely had any food, no.
Yeah, I think we were asked by someone online to ask you about that, but it does, yeah. When you put it that way, it does actually, it does seem to make a lot more sense, doesn't it?
Looking at it from where we are now, tape recorders, no, nothing like that. I think there were a few somebody had a camera because we have a few photographs, it's true, but no, nothing moving that I remember.
Can I just ask also, because you did all the magazine covers, and what sort of influenced you sort of artistically?
That's a very interesting question, and I've been asked that before, and I try to root around for what I might have been influenced by. And to tell you the truth, the only thing I can think of really is acid, which I had, quite an entheogenic history before I joined the process. Now, the process didn't, was anti-entheogens, anti-drugs of basically any kind, so I had that sort of 15-year break, but I think probably it came from that. And when I later saw the stuff that was coming out of San Francisco, and I realized, my goodness, that's very, very similar.
Yeah.
And of course, it came from the same kind of acid perception.
So one thing, just going back to the kind of when you moved to Mexico, obviously that's quite a different environment to the UK. So I was wondering if you could talk about kind of like how being in Mexico affected the community, or built the community. It must have had some kind of effect, I suppose, on the group. Being in this completely different.
Yes, tremendously bonding. It was very hard living. Sleeping out in the open, with spiders that jump at you and bite you, and coral snakes that wrap around your legs and things. Yeah, no, it was extremely bonding in a sort of foxhole sort of way. The most bonding thing was when the hurricane came, because there was a major hurricane, I think it was called Inez, and it was heading straight for us. The British consul came down and, instructed us to leave, and we said no. We felt that the gods had shown us this place, and we were going to stay, and see what happened. So, we all meditated like crazy, and the hurricane shifted. It moved and went along the coast and hit Santa Cruz instead. And when I was doing research for the book, I pulled up the map that showed the direction that Inez moved, and you can actually see that little jog. It was heading straight to the Yucatan Peninsula. You can see it just jogging away a little bit.
Oh, that's good.
Whether it was our meditation, whether it was our faith, whether it was one of God's jokes, who knows? But it really, it bonded us very closely.
When you say you sort of all meditated a lot, and I'm just really interested, and I'm quite a lot of people I speak to are interested in what sort of meditation or magic or ritual that the Process Church did, and did you had like a mass, and was that similar to something like a Gnostic mass in the OTO or anything? Yeah.
I don't know the Gnostic mass of the OTO, but I would imagine it was not dissimilar. Put it that way. In temperament, it was more like being in an American black church. There was a lot of energy. The music was, everybody singing. The music was good, very loud. We just made an album of the process music, the liturgical music.
Interesting. So these kind of sound a bit more like, I guess, kind of Christian sermons, or compared to say an occult ritual. Was there any kind of occult influence in the Process Church, or like Western? I guess
that's a kind of difficult question to answer, because one would have to start defining what one meant by occult.
Yeah, because there may be the Western esoteric tradition, or stuff like the Golden Dawn, as the Crow.
Really, no. We were very much powered by intuition, and also Mary Ann's intuition. She was very much the force behind it all, certainly on a sort of spiritual level anyway, or psychic level. So yeah.
There was one place also interested in America, I think it was somewhere in California. There was a house called and referred to as a spiral staircase. I hear that members of the process used to hang out there, and also all kinds of other people. Anton LaVey, I hear, and and even Charles Manson, and I've sort of read, I'm not sure how true it is, but that was sort of where Charles Manson maybe met people from the process.
Yeah, no, I've actually been asked that one before, because I think that's something going around the net. No, to my knowledge, and I would have known, nothing to do with the spiral staircase. It was in Malibu. We were in LA for such a short time. I doubt very much if Robert and Marianne would have gone without me knowing about it. No, and also we'd never met Manson. The only time we ever met Manson was when two of us went to interview him in prison.
Yeah. So, I mean, what actually would you say changed with the Process Church over its kind of its long history? I mean, obviously you started off as a community, and then you started to become a community that produced literature. And how do you see how do you see how the group kind of evolved over the years? How did it how do you see the Process Church going from this small community to now what's it called, the kind of animal rescue centre, isn't it? So...
Best friends, yes. I would say disillusionment, probably. We tried to, I'll put it in our terms, right? It sounds arrogant, but I'll put it in our terms, right? We tried to, help people see the truth. People weren't interested, so screw it. We're going to just help the animals. That's the kind of long and the short of it.
So, humanity is the devil.
Well, says Robert de Grimston. I have no doubt that we are living on a hellish planet. Whether it's hell or not, I don't know. I think we create our own hells and heavens.
The one thing I'd like to talk about, because we haven't really kind of covered it, I guess, is really the kind of the theology of the Process Church. I was wondering if you could maybe talk about how that kind of evolved, from what's essentially a psychological group, as you said before, or kind of an offshoot of Scientology in some ways.
No, it's certainly not an offshoot of Scientology. Absolutely not. In fact, they would really object to that, and we would too. No, nothing to do with Scientology. The only thing to do with it was that we used their e-meter for about 2 or 3 years, and then we scrapped it because we became so telepathic we could do it without an e-meter.
Excellent.
The theological thing, that really emerged out of a psychological series of understandings that people group themselves, and the Enneagram, I think, has whatever it is, 11 different, there are different ways of grouping people, but we saw that they fell into 4 basic categories, if you like. So when we became a church, we had to kind of formalize the religious aspect of it. And we'd already been sort of dealing with the idea of, okay, what is a Jehovian type? Okay, Jehovian type is the authoritarian, say Republican, conservative, anyway, but yeah, you get the picture anyway. That's the Jehovian type. Then, okay, what's the Luciferian type? Much more easygoing, perhaps more creative, more intuitive, and, on the negative thing, a little more lazy and sloppy and easygoing. Right? What would be a satanic type? Well, satanic type would be the fiery, passionate, maybe destructive under certain conditions, revolutionary, rebellious. And what would be the Christ type would be obviously the unifying, the bringing it all together, the one that has a foot in every camp. So these were the kind of the 4 personalities. Now, again, it breaks down. You could say, well, some people have a Jehovah Satan mix, or some people have a Jehovah Christ mix, or a Jehovah Lucifer. No, I don't think we went. No, I think we went that. So then they created 8 different types of people. To a certain extent, it was really kind of jammed together as a religion in order to get the tax breaks you get in America if you have a religion. So I don't feel very tremendously comfortable about it because I never really agreed with any of that. I didn't follow the religious aspect. I was more interested in the unification and the spiritual aspects of it. And then when I had my near-death experience, that was so real compared to the kind of dogma and rubbish that we were talking that it made all the theological stuff that we were talking about personally to me rather meaningless.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, obviously, one thing is kind of unavoidable when you sort of start to research the Process Church, but there's obviously a lot of controversy around the group, and obviously, in your latest book, you try and cut through a lot of that and kind of clear things up a little bit. But obviously, I mean, we'd obviously like to talk to you about it as well, if you don't mind. And there's
of course.
so obviously the biggest connection you always hear about is Charles Manson and the Process Church, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, and also about just talk about that really. I mean, what is the connection between, if any, between the Process Church and Charles Manson?
Well, I think the bottom line is that there's no connection whatsoever. We never met him, as I say, until we went to interview him. It was unfortunate that he happened to live on the same street in San Francisco that we had a chapter. Now, I don't think it was the same time period, and the street called Cole Street is a very long street. I think there's a rumor going around that somebody saw Manson's bus parked outside our chapter. Now, if you ever lived in San Francisco, you know what the parking is like there. If you can find a parking place anywhere. And, it's kind of easy to point out that if Manson had come to visit the Process and had been able to park his van in front of the bus when he was visiting, then he probably had some pretty hot mojo going, because it's very hard to park anywhere in San Francisco. Anyway, so that was that. We were in L.A., I think, 3 years before he was, or anything happened there, the Manson murders there. It was really, I have to say, basically Scientology that did it, that put the finger on us.
Charles Manson is definitely a very, very interesting character. But I mean, what was who sort of decided within the church to say, "Oh, we're going to go and interview him for our magazine"? And what was the reason behind what was it that you wanted?
We were doing a magazine on death, and as I said earlier, we like to represent extremes.
Yeah.
And so we thought, well, who would know more about extremes of death than Charlie Manson?
Yeah.
And so we went to interview him, and we set him against, if you remember, Malcolm Muggeridge, who in the 50s and 60s was a Catholic convert, and a very, very sort of hot Catholic Christian. And nobody comments on that. Comments on the Manson. So it was stupid on one level. The book, The Family, hasn't come out by that time. It came out, I think, in 71. It just seemed to us a good idea. Why not?
Yeah.
And we were, we thought of ourselves as very cool. I remember going and spending some time with that Lincoln Rockwell, the American Nazi person. Not because I liked him, or just simply because he was an extreme personality.
Risky.
One thing actually I really want to go back to very quickly is the magazines all seem to have very definite themes to them. Why did you decide to bring out a magazine like that, where you'd have very, like you say, very extreme kind of points of view, and they often seem to conflict with each other in some ways from the ones I've managed to read.
I mean, that's the whole issue about uniting the opposites.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think the theme came basically, certainly because other magazines weren't doing themes. That Parabola magazine, which I think wasn't around then, has been doing themes now for years. But because we had this fundamental concept of unification of opposites, it was particularly compatible with that sort of, it's a very good way of outputting that theme, because you can get, well, let's take the Manson and Muggeridge example, you can get these very different views, which, people aren't trying to reconcile. We were just saying, okay, here are the views. You make of it what you will.
Yeah.
We weren't going to do the work for them.
Now, obviously, the second, I guess, controversial figure that often gets bandied together with the Process Church is the son of Sam killer. Could you talk a little bit about why that happened? Why is there some kind of connection or alleged connection rather, I should say, between the son of Sam killer and the Process Church?
Yeah, the connection is German Shepherds and a gentleman called Maury Terry, who's one of these bottom feeder writers, and he just got it into his head because the Process had broken up by that time, so he probably thought he could just, juggle things around. We had German Shepherds, and somehow German Shepherds were involved in the Son of Sam thing. I don't know how. We were out of New York by that time anyway. I think, when did the Son of Sam things happen? 78 or something like that.
Didn't the Process...
No, we had no connection with it. It was just,
Didn't the Process Church sue... did they sue him for over that book, or was it a different book? I can't remember.
Yeah, when The Family came out, the American version had a chapter basically vilifying the Process and, calling us cannibals and murderers and goodness knows what. It was a frightful piece of work in order to bolster his theory that the Process was behind Manson, right? So he had to make us even worse than Manson. So yes, we didn't sue him. What we did is I can't remember the American legal terms, but anyway, we got that chapter removed from the American version of it. But when they published the book in England, of course, it was a different matter because we had a very conservative judge. We were very stupid by that time. Robert and Marianne decided not to represent themselves, or to, but to have, some of my colleagues represent them. Of course, it's a terrible mistake. So we lost that case. And in the English version of it, they put the chapter back in.
Okay.
So that's basically what happened.
There's another name that you refer to in your book as this character being dark, and his name also comes up in sort of all kinds of conspiracy type circles. But that's Tommy. Is it Tommy Baumler?
Tommy Baumler, yes. Yeah. Yes, I really had nothing much. We were looking for a lawyer. Tommy was the person we used to make us into a church. He was a very flamboyant character, and I think a lot of the very, flamboyant wording of the Process, all that sort of contractual stuff, was very much up to him. He was thrilled by the whole thing.
Didn't he recommend the name of the church was, I can't remember what it is, was it the Church of Christ and Satan?
Church of Christ and Satan, I think, was the thing that appealed to him, but it was a little too in your face for us.
So, the last person I kind of want to bring up in regards to the Process Church was one we were asked. Have you ever heard of a group called The Hand before? And is there a connection between The Hand and the Process Church? I have no idea what it means.
No, I haven't either.
No.
I have no idea. The Hand, is it a group, a cult, a way?
We don't really know. Ask Timothy about when Rob told Jack to leave
Stool
and start working for The Hand in the north of Mexico.
No. Firstly, there was no Jack at Stool.
Yeah.
Secondly, Robert wouldn't have been in a situation to tell anyone to leave. I was the only person that I know who was told to leave. I sat outside for 3 days before being invited back. No, that's just a make-up story. And The Hand, I don't know, was it Mexican Mafia or something?
No.
I would have known something like that.
There's obviously always sort of seems to be sort of a resurge of interest in the Process in sort of the 80s with the Temple of Psychic Youth and Genesis P. Origin, and then in the 90s and sort of now with the Church of Holy Terror, which is sort of a musical kind of thing with bands that are influenced by the philosophies of the Process. But I just wondered, why do you think it's sort of carried on being such a popular thing and people get very interested in it, particularly in like a lot of the Topi writings as really very heavily influenced by the Process?
Yes, I'm actually not aware of some of the stuff that you just talked about in terms of, the contemporary influences. I know Genesis was very influenced. I think probably we were so certain of ourselves, and we were, we didn't hide away. We were out on the streets. We had long, our hair down to our waist. We had flowing capes and, Mendes goats around our necks and crosses with snakes twined around them. We jump around and sell our magazines. We were very out there in a way that you don't see these days, where everybody is so sort of into themselves and a little scared that, I shouldn't say this, I shouldn't say that. We continued to plot our copybook again and again by doing things that we thought were perfectly understandable, but they, of course, would be completely misunderstood again and again. I mean, I remember, for instance, giving a talk in a speaker's corner at Hyde Park, and talking all volubly and everything, until I started smelling smoke, and I realized that somebody had lit a fire under my soapbox, and I was just slowly going up in flames. So it's that.
It's outrageous.
It was that kind of experience, and many people had those sorts of experiences. Plus, there was an awful lot of magic going on. I mean, the fact that a hurricane missed us was really an extraordinary thing. Then we got into telepathy, and we were pretty damn good at it. We had a coffee house called Satan's Cabin that a lot of the most interesting people in the 60s used to come to. So I think it was really a sort of a punctuation point in a sort of a rather deteriorating social situation that we've seen over the last 40 or 50 years. It was something exciting. It was vital. It was virile. It was it was a real challenge.
Yeah, it's definitely something. One answer to the question maybe as well. I guess it's the group itself were one of, I don't know, I can't think of any modern groups that have kind of thrown themselves into it as much as you guys seem to do.
No.
Yeah.
That's exactly it, Ken. I think, there's a certain, I don't know how old you are. You're probably, in your 30s?
Yes, I am, yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people in their 30s that I come across doing the book tours have a tremendous interest in this time because they weren't there. They want to know about it, because it was really unlike the time right now, although it might be rather like a time to come. But it was so intense. The fear of imminent devastation, as somebody said, it sharpens your brain when you know you're going to die the next day. And I think that, we really had the juice going.
Yeah, definitely.
And also the aesthetic of the process is sort of so striking, like this symbology and the idea of sort of dualities of Christ and Satan, and like your magazine, the artwork for all the magazines is just really, really powerful, and it's just like really visually sort of, I don't know, just stimulating. It's brilliant. That's what really got me interested in it, actually.
Oh, thank you so much. The funny thing about it, of course, is, as I'm sure you've done things in the past, and you just do them, you forget about them, and then 30 years later somebody says, hey, these were the start of the psychedelic magazine. Say, what?
Yeah, another thing, actually, I was going to ask you just before we move on to your more recent work is, was Timothy Leary ever involved with the Process Church? He's someone I'm very interested in, and I was wondering if he ever did you ever interact with him in any way, sort of during that period of time?
Well, yes, I did indeed, and in my book I have, really quite an interesting little. I spent 3 days with him in a wigwam, a teepee up in Millbrook. And it was just before he was busted in California.
Yeah.
And that kind of led to all his various different escapades. But he'd reached a point, it was very interesting, he'd reached a point in his life when he had started to realize that he really screwed up, that it hadn't been the way to go. Right? As you probably know, there was this big thing between Huxley and Leary, where Huxley said, for goodness sake, dribble it down from the elite, and Leary being Leary said, no, everybody should have it, And of course, by 19, whatever it was, by the late 60s, we could see kind of the damage it was doing, because powerful entheogens are not for everybody.
No.
You know, they can do as much damage as they can do good, and people have to come on them on their own. You know, a guy of 20, you know, taking 500 micrograms of acid and going to a club and totally freaking out. I mean, that's not what entheogens are for. They're spiritual tools, for goodness sake. There he started really to get interested in what we were doing. And so I took him down to we had one of our Sabbath assemblies. And unfortunately, that particular day, we had, you referred to it earlier, we had what we called a revelation. Now, it wasn't a prepared speech, and that was very important. It was always to come off the top. So, you know, people never knew what they were going to say, or, you know. And it, unfortunately, in this particular assembly, in the revelation, was given by a rather ignorant Scottish man. And when he was giving an example, he gave an example using the American president, but he talked about Eisenhower instead of whoever the president was. And I looked at Larry, and I saw Larry's face drop.
Yeah.
And I realized that was it, you know.
Right, so...
And off he went. I met him many times after that in civilian life, but that was it for the process.
So, I mean, you said earlier on you had a near-death experience, and this obviously changed the way you thought. You know, it changed your work personally, and you know, what you did and what you've produced since the Process Church. And can you talk a little bit about what happened with this near-death experience and what it was about the near-death experience that changed you so much? I guess.
Yes. Well, the first thing about a near-death experience which changes you is the realization that there is more going on here than meets the eye. I won't go through the stages of it, but essentially what happened was that I was told that I was dying. I was shown how I would die if I would continue. I was told that I had accomplished what I had come to do, and that I was given the choice that I could either continue or I could go back. And when I thought about it, continuing, I could predict in the sense that this was the most wonderful thing that I had ever imagined. I mean, death is just, that's why they save it at the end, you know. It's the most wonderful thing in the world. But I didn't know what would happen if I came back. And so I made the choice to come back. And then the whole thing dissolved, and there were angels all over the place playing music and boogieing. And then I was taken into a big structure, and a machine came down and it healed me. And then I was taken to another place and shown it until I would forget what I'd seen. And then I found myself back in my body, healed, and I was all healed. But what blew my mind, of course, was it really exists. There really is life after death. You know, it's not a belief system anymore. It's something I know.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, knowing that, it completely reduces any fear of death. And fear of death is the basic hole that everybody, everybody's in. And everything else is a ricochet of the fundamental fear of death. That's how they control us.
So to be convinced of that would actually change your outlook on life generally, I suppose. Totally.
Yeah. On every level. Because the mundane then becomes, you realize, okay, this is something we have to go through. There are lessons to be learned here. But it's only part of a very, very, very large story and a very large and long journey.
And so if you remove that fear of death as well, then it must be a useful tool amongst many other things.
Yes, it is. It allows you to swim out into the middle of the Gulf of Mexico in the hope of having dolphins save you in the middle of a storm, and they didn't.
Right, I was going to talk to you about dolphins in just a second, but one of your works I'm quite interested in is, I think I mispronounced it earlier as well, it's the Helianics proposition?
The Helianics proposition,
okay,
yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about, this is a book, isn't it, that you've actually produced, could you tell us a little bit about what the Helianics proposition is, please? I will pronounce it right one day.
You're dealing with it, yes, Helianics. It was something that actually came through in the text, what I call the text of it. came through in about a 3-hour, I don't know quite what to call it, automatic writing, channeling. It didn't stop. It just went on.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized, my question that I had asked, because that's what really our training in the process was. You ask a question, and then you listen. You really listen, and you can get answers, obviously, from your intuition and from guides and angels and goodness knows what. And this whole slab of information about who was the serpent in the Garden of Eden. I said, okay, let's accept that mythic situation. We've got the first 2 humans, whether or not they were the first 2 humans is another matter. And then we had this talking snake. What's that doing?
Yeah.
I mean, it's absurd. For 2,000 years, people have peddled this story with a talking snake. I mean, anyway, so I found out what the talking snake was all about, and that's what the Helix basically is. It's an extraterrestrial entity that arrived here. And this is, I should say, a myth. I'm not saying this is what happened or true, but it's a convenient myth for the rebel, for the outsider, for the one who knows as opposed to the one who has to believe.
Yeah,
different viewpoint.
Another thing you seem to have developed an interest in is dolphins and extraterrestrials. I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about your work with dolphins and extraterrestrials.
Yes, I'd just been coming out of my period of being a businessman in New York, and I happened to see a couple of short films by biologists. And in one of them, I could clearly see that there was an example of dolphin telepathy. Now, it wasn't commented on. I won't go through the things that I write about in one of my books. It wasn't commented on by the people in the boat, but it was very clear that what was going on. So I thought, my goodness, that's very interesting. I'd like to go and look into this a bit more. Within a day or two, some friends in Florida called my girlfriend, would we like to come and stay with them? The dolphins were jumping. I had not much interest in dolphins before then. Went down to Florida, meditated on the beach, felt the presence of dolphins, opened my eyes, and there was a group of dolphins just swimming offshore. So I went in, plunged in, and then for the next 10 days, basically, was put through a whole series of experiences and experiments by the dolphins. What is human anger? I had some specific questions for the dolphins, too. How do you pass information from generation to generation? Do you store information? And they showed me how they stored information holographically by pinging shells, for instance, with a particular tone in which they stored information in the shell. The shell would then grow, but the information would be retained. And another dolphin could come along, ping it with the same frequency, and get the image back that the previous dolphin had imprinted in the shell. So they were showing me all sorts of things. Now, on the last day, one of my questions was, okay, we know that extraterrestrials come and go on the planet. They come and go in the oceans. What do you make of them? And on the last day, we had this very, very clear extraterrestrial lights in the sky kind of thing, which lasted 20 minutes. But within a week back in New York, we saw a literal flying saucer flying over, your basic flying saucer flying over New York, and then had a whole experience with a little boy who wandered up, who's clearly some kind of telepathic mouthpiece for the guys in the ship, because he was saying things we haven't seen, we haven't seen an image of this planet for 10,000 years. Things like that. I mean, outlandish things, but they all made sense. He told me about the system of politics in this area of the universe, something called antithesis, which is one person, one vote way of dealing with things. I mean, it was quite an extraordinary episode.
How long ago was this? Sorry, how many sort of years?
This is 81.
Oh, right, okay.
81. And that then another situation opened up with a young trance medium in Toronto, because angels had been made real to me in my near-death experience, I had become interested in the angelic reality. So when I heard about this lad who was channeling angels, I went and spent a couple of weeks with him, and got a whole lot of very interesting angelic information. So it was, in a sense, it was like the Dolphins led to the extraterrestrials, then led me to the angels. And basically, that's really where I have been working for the last 20 years.
And you've actually released... Go on, so you've released a book called Ask Your Angels, haven't you? Which I assume is related to that, what you just mentioned, yeah.
Yes, I wrote that with a couple of other people back in the 90s as a manual for contacting your companion angels, your guardian angels, which is one of the things that the angels up in Toronto had told us everybody can do. I didn't have to rely on somebody else channeling it. I could do it. So I took it very seriously, and I spent basically 2 years perfecting that particular tool.
Is that in any way similar to, say, the John D. Enochian system of contacting angels, or is this a completely different system?
This was a system essentially, I guess, shown by the angels. I can't speak for D and whatever his name was.
Kelly.
Kelly, that's right. It seemed a bit complicated to me. And also the way that Crowley dealt with it seemed to be a little more complicated than is necessary. Because what is real is that the angels basically want to talk to us. This is a very key time in not only our evolution, but their evolution as well. And it seems to be extremely important that we have open communication with entities that know about us, but also know about what our plans, what our deep soul plans were and are. So it's a question like being in the right place at the right time. How does one do that? Well, one does it by being in contact with one's angel.
Yeah. And, how was this book received, Ask Your Angels? I mean, is this like obviously, I mean, like I said, what I was saying earlier, there's this Enochian system, and that always seems to be very popular with the magical community. How did this book go down, I guess, with that community in mind?
I'm not sure how it went down with the occult community, because I think they might have seen it as being a little more simplistic. When you're focused on one thing in your life, you tend to try and complicate it as much as possible in order to validate your interest in it.
Yes,
angels actually are terribly easy to contact, because when people contact their angels, the first thing they really say is, is that it? But I know that. I know that voice. That sort of thing. I know that all my life.
Yeah.
So it's a sense of familiarity. And one doesn't have to go through all this jiggery-pokery and sex magic and things like that. So that's fun.
Are you working on any new projects you'd like to talk about, or?
I have a book, the most recent book in that, the little trilogy there, was Dolphins, ETs, and Angels, was the first of the books. And the second was Adventures Among Spiritual Intelligences, which really takes the information in the first book and then works with it. And I travel all over the world, basically, working with shamans and various different communities, applying the kind of information that I got in the first book. And then the third book, which I've just finished, I try and write one of these books every 10 years. It's called Rising Angels, and that's just been accepted by Inner Traditions, which is the big spiritual publishing over here. So that should be coming out next year.
And obviously you've just recently had a book about the Process Church released through Feral House.
That's right.
How's that actually? How did that go down? I imagine that sold quite well.
Yes, it's becoming a cult book about cults. It's bubbling along. I mean, this is not an easy time to sell books.
No,
people are really kind of pulled in, as probably but I mean, the internet also has opened a lot of things up. Ask Your Angels is doing very well. I mean, I think it's 750,000 sold or something like that.
Wow, that's
I
good.
think it's in 10 or 11 languages, so it's out there.
Good.
And it still maintains basically the best manual if you want to learn how to communicate with your angels. It's the best manual out there to do it.
Excellent. Well, Timothy, thanks a lot for giving us some of your time. I really appreciate it.
Real pleasure, Ken. Thank you so much
for
being interested in